hair doesn't necessarily protect you from a shiny head, guys.
Good evening, and I'll call the Business Committee meeting of Wednesday, November the 10th to order. It's with great respect and humility that we acknowledge and honor the lands and the Snuneymuxw people. The Snuneymuxw people maintain their profound, unique, and spiritual connection to the land through ageless traditions, teachings, stewardship, and expressions of reciprocity. So welcome, everybody. We have a couple of items here on the agenda to go through here tonight, so hoping that everything goes smoothly. So can I get a motion to adopt the agenda? Any additions, deletions, or changes in order? Okay, sorry, I did that a bit backwards, but I see that Trustee Mckay moved to adopt the agenda. Do you have a seconder? Seconded by Trustee Higginson. Is there any opposition to adopting the agenda? And I take it there's, I'll ask anyways, are there any additions or deletions? I should have asked first and I apologize for that, but I'll give everyone a chance just to weigh in case I missed something. So moving on, just a note about the minutes. So former Trustee Barron and now MP-elect Barron, it was not in attendance on the October 13th meeting, I don't believe. So that has been reflected in the minutes now. Can I get a mover for the motion? Moved by Trustee Berzovic, and do we have a seconder? Trustee Higginson. Is there anyone opposed to adopting the minutes of the October 13th Business Committee? Seeing none, the motion carries. Moving on, we do not have any presentations this evening. So moving on to item number 8, senior staff reports. We have a number this evening, and the first one is on our proposed anti-racism and cultural safety administrative procedure update. Mr. Davey, please go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, it's my pleasure to just be able to turn this over to Carrie Steele, Director of Instruction for Inclusive Education. And thank you, Ms. Steele.
Good evening, everyone. Through the chair, I'll just share a little bit of information from the information sheet that was provided to everyone this evening. So we were engaged in a review of this admin procedure through a good chunk of last year, actually. We worked through a lot of the information with the Safe Schools Committee, so it did involve quite a number of partners in our community. We have representatives from CUPE, from the NDTA, from our Principals and Vice Principals Association, as well as Literacy Nanaimo and the Multicultural Society. Our settlement workers in schools were involved, so we had some really good dialogue about it last year. And we're recommending updates to this AP for a couple of reasons. One is that it doesn't really reflect the current social context and also contains outdated language. That begins right at the title of it, actually. The previous admin procedure 350 was titled Honoring Diversity and Challenging Racism, and we really wanted to strengthen that language, so the new one is titled Anti-Racism and Cultural Safety. And so there are a number of specific changes. One is the name. The other is editing the style and presentation of the document to reflect the structure of other APs that have been updated more recently. This one was quite lengthy and just presented information in a way that wasn't in keeping with kind of our current practices with it. We also felt we wanted to reorient it around some key themes. These are themes that we're seeing in the research literature, but it's also the themes that are surfacing in conversation in the schools and in our community in terms of the areas of focus. So we would really like to focus on building and maintaining community, on honoring cultural and linguistic diversity, and having inclusive and anti-racist curriculum in our schools, and supporting staff development and learning. We also revised in partnership with some of our elders and knowledge keepers through Ted Cadwallader before he retired. He helped us work through a revision to the land acknowledgement section, and then we also included some pieces on district response. There's a stronger emphasis on intersectionality and individual safety, and we also really want to articulate staff responsibilities at the district, school, and individual level. we feel like this work is partly done with the AP as it stands now. We do feel the AP itself is ready to go, but we also want to continue some really good dialogue over the course of this school year. We feel that we would really like some really intentional collaboration, and we would really like to engage in our community in a really direct way with our students, with our staff, in developing some companion documents for stakeholders. So while it identifies responsibilities for teachers, for example, or identifies responsibilities for students, we'd like to have a companion document that really explains that in more detail and shows kind of the how and the why in a little bit more of a layered way. So our intention is to work through these stakeholder groups at our schools, and then bring that information back to the Safe Schools Committee for some further dialogue and create some companion appendices that would go to this AP. We also know that the inclusion policy 210 is in the process of being updated. So if additional changes for this AP are indicated after that process concludes, then we absolutely would reopen it and take a look at that as well. So those are kind of the biggest pieces of the change. And I know you've been provided with copies of both the previous and recommended update. I know we often provide a copy with track changes to make that easier to follow, but in this case there were so many changes that it actually made it impossible to see what was old and what was new, so we've just provided you with both versions of the document.
Thank you, Ms. Steele, and I guess I'll just say thank you to you and all the staff and stakeholders who were involved in this work. I appreciate, or believe I can appreciate, the amount of effort and thought that goes into this type of work, and it's definitely seen when I was reading through the level of detail and thought that went into the work. So thank you. So what I'll do is I'll open it up for questions. So anyone who would like to ask a question, please do so by typing in the chat. And the first on our list this evening is Trustee Stanley.
Hi, thank you. So I'm really glad to hear the plan for companion documents. I do, but like, incorporating this in a bigger way. I do have concerns about the fact that the AP came before the policy update, and I think that might result in some significant changes in the AP. But what I wanted to check in about was, I was on the Safe Schools Committee when we started this process, but it's been some time, and you talked a little bit about the process, but I want to hear a little bit more details about the, what led to the finalized document, what consultations occurred, how we kind of reflected the intent of creating a document that would help direct anti-racism work in the district, and create a more culturally safe environment. I'm just kind of curious if you could talk to me what's happened in the past about that.
So
process.
Sure. So we did a few things. One is that we do have a learning coordinator who is part of the provincial ARC BC network, which is looking at gender identity, sexual orientation, and so she had lots of information coming back from ARC and SOGI around some of the documentation and training and just initiatives that are happening around the province. We also are really connected to the Multicultural Society, so we're connected to information that's coming. Not just narrative information, but documentation and resources and things that are being developed in the region. Our settlement workers in schools are very connected to families, and so they brought back some information from some of our new Canadian families and some of their experiences both in the community and in our schools. We had a lot of conversation at the committee around, do we want to do a survey? Do we want to have some focus groups? How would we like to reach out to our student community and learn a little bit more? And the feedback we got from both our English language learning teachers and also our teachers that are leading our social justice groups, our GSA groups, things like that, was the really vulnerable people who are having some of the more impactful experiences that need to be surfaced and explored are not individuals who feel safe enough to respond to surveys, to show up in a room and share their opinion in a community of people that they don't know very well, to speak to a stranger who's asking them a question. So while we believe that some of those places are places we can go for more information as we move forward, what we actually did was reach out to adults who were connected with kids in some of these environments and ways at schools, and they had some quiet conversation and collected some anecdotal, you know, we've been talking about street data a little bit. We collected a whole bunch of street data just to make sure that we were listening to some of our kids and families that maybe don't feel they can kind of publicly share some of their concerns and things. So we collected a bunch of information there. The other thing we did was take a look. This work is, there's lots of energy around this provincially right now. So we took a look at some of the documentation and admin procedures, policies, just practices, resources, and things that some of our other provincial school districts have been engaging in. And actually the notion for the appendices was drawn from some work we'd seen in a couple of other areas where we could get out in front of the conversation and signal its importance and the value that we place on it. Our worry was, you know, kind of like waiting for the inclusion policy to be done. I mean, we have good language in our inclusion policy. It's something that's been held up across the province as being a strong document. That doesn't mean we don't want to take a look at it and revise it and make appropriate changes, because for sure we want to do that. But I think we had something that said we were an inclusive place and we wanted to value inclusion and diversity in our district. And so that as a baseline wasn't a bad place to begin with these conversations. We wanted a new AP with a new title to signal to the system that we really are invested in this work. We really want to take the time and care it deserves to really have robust supportive things in place for our community and our schools. But we also know that when you rush those things, you miss important pieces of them. So our thinking was that we signal with a solid document that indicates the direction that we're going, and then we really intentionally reach out on a really regular basis to have conversations and keep adding the layers as we go. If this is a moment, it's not going to work. If it's a process and a recursive conversation where we're surfacing things and engaging people in ongoing dialogue, that's where we're going to get some traction and be able to really make an impactful change for some of our vulnerable kids. So that was the thinking behind it. But I do feel like there's lots of resources and dialogue and good just research and network connections that are supporting us as well.
Thank you, Ms. Steele. Would you like a follow-up, Trustee Stanley? I see that you popped off the screen, so maybe not. Okay, thank you. Next on the list is Trustee Higginson.
Thanks for the detailed answers you just gave to Trustee Stanley and the background information. And I appreciate the work that's gone into this so far. And I too am really, I'm struggling a lot with the process, and that's, I guess, not anyone's fault here, but the fact that we've created an AP that actually states in the introduction to it, I guess it's in the action sheet, that we might need to update the AP, and we're going to create appendices to an AP throughout the school year that might need to be updated based on the work of the policy. I'm feeling like we're a bit of a chicken and the egg, and I'm not sure which one should be coming first, but I am also concerned with the lack of what I see in here, and maybe you can help explain it through to me. What seems to me to be a lack of an acknowledgement of systemic racism. It's mentioned twice, but it's mentioned only in the anti-racism under purpose, only in anti-racism. There doesn't seem, and maybe I missed it and I fully acknowledge that, there's lots of discussion about racism, but there's not a lot of discussion and acknowledgement about systemic racism and prevalence of systemic racism. And I'm concerned about the lack of that acknowledgement and having that woven through. And so I'm wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about that and walk me through whether that was intentional, whether it was unintentional, what the process was to determine the language, because most importantly, words matter when it comes to this type of a policy.
They do, for sure. So I think I think some of these questions are they're connected in that like the chicken and the egg piece, as well as the language in the AP piece. In our minds, we had quite a bit of conversation at the table around policy versus administrative procedure. And where we landed was that administrative procedure, the purpose of an AP is to direct the practice and intentions of people, and it's supported by policy, right? So we were trying to have kind of marching orders and action steps in this. And our feeling was that defining things like systemic racism, while that is an aspect of our communities and it's certainly something that we see, you know, impacting schools, that felt, I guess, a little bit political and outside of here's what you need to do at school to address these concerns. So I feel like I'm speaking a little bit for a whole committee, and it's been some time since we had some conversation about this, so I'm a little bit hesitant to really explore it super deeply right now. I think it's something that would be worth bringing back to the committee and having some conversation if that's an aspect that the board would like us to have a little more conversation around, certainly. But we were trying to draw attention to the aspects of curriculum and the interactions in the building and the things that we would like to see in place. And so that was the intent of this document. Whether referring to systemic racism separate from racism and anti-racism statements that are in it is something that's needed, we can, you know, I can certainly take that feedback.
Can I just have a follow-up, Greg?
You may.
Thanks. So I guess the reason why I bring it up is there's certainly a lot of focus on individual and you know, on the experience. So even ensuring in, you know, individual safety, individual's experience. But my concern is that without an acknowledgement, and again, this maybe is the chicken and the egg, without an acknowledgement, a strong acknowledgement of systemic racism in the system, and even in the AP, a desire to acknowledge and dismantle in an intentional way, then we aren't actually getting at the crux of what might be causing those things for individuals to not feel safe and not have a good experience. And so I'm trying to understand why the committee chose that specific direction. And I think I'm hearing from you just that perhaps that's a policy issue. And perhaps it's something that will have to be reflected once the policy is updated. But I am concerned that for some reading this outside of a policy that says it, there might be a concern that there isn't an acknowledgement of that within our school district. And if this is all we have right now, and this is where we're focusing our attention, if we don't acknowledge it and have something in here that talks about dismantling it, then my fear is that we are going to continue to perpetuate the things that injure these students and cause and the families and staff and cause them to not feel safe. So that's I know it's a big topic. It's a big question. It's my concern so far. I'm here without my team, so I'm certainly open to taking that feedback back to the folks that have worked on it with me and having some more conversation. Yeah, it's a hard one to explore on my own tonight, so I can certainly take that with me.
Thanks again, Ms. Steele. Trustee Stanley, you're next on the list.
Hi, yeah, it is a big one. You know, kudos for you to be brave enough to stand up here and tackle this important, challenging, even a little scary, threatening, you know, political issue that, you know, is related to harm that occurs in our communities. And I don't want to underestimate the challenge that is before you and the challenge in creating this document. I do have a lot of concerns about it, and I guess what it seems like is it might be kind of, you know, various iterations, and that's fine, right? Like I when I was there, and it was a while ago, but there was a real clear commitment to getting it right, but you know, there's lots of challenges in doing that. So I appreciate the feedback that Trustee Higginson just gave, and I agree with her comments, and I I'll add, I'm going to kind of supplement in some ways. But first, let me explain why, which is when I read this document and knowing it's an AP, and it's a little bit hard to, as a board member, to comment on an AP, especially when we don't really, like, we have a policy, but we haven't gotten to the revamped, updated version of it. But I know that this, as you said, was intended to direct practice. I found it, in reading it, a little bit unclear about that specific of directing practices. So when I read some of the sentences, I felt like I didn't really understand what the intent was or what that meant for staff. And I don't know if that is going to be further explained by the appendices or the additional information that you suggested, and as well the policy. So I'm seeing that this is a process that we're all going to engage in to get this right, and that it might take a number of processes or iterations to get it right. I do think that maybe more explicit statements might be necessary, acknowledging that there's, acknowledging systemic racism, things like talking about implicit bias, and not just overt racism. So I think that I recognize that it's very challenging, but what I would like to see, I would hope for our staff is it to be a little bit more explicit and a little bit more detailed, in the sense that it does provide that clearer topic definition and direction. And I just felt like it wasn't quite there. But I do recognize, and my question is this, and I guess I'm a bit confused in the sense that, I don't know if you have a thought, so you guys have talked about where the policy, the AP, and then the other documents fit in, and where you really see that those statements or those kind of more explicit aspects of it occurring, so that we all know, like what cultural safety is, so we all know how that should manifest in our schools. I'm not sure if it was intended to have it show up later in other documents, or it was intended to have it here, in which case I think it needs to be a little bit more bold.
Thank you, Trustee Stanley. I'm not sure I had heard a question there, but I do see that Mr. Walsh has popped up and would like to speak. If there's a question, please maybe pare it down a little bit and come back on the list, and we can ask your question. So go ahead, Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to take a moment to remind the board that the kind of administrative procedure piece, so that the chicken and the egg concept is, I think that we, in a number of times, have come to a place where we realize that we have an AP that needs updating, and it'll happen perhaps prior to the updating of a policy. And so we have an example with respect to our surplus policy. So we came with the AP knowing full well that the board is going to be engaged in a review of the policy. And of course, we brought an AP that was in alignment with the current policy, and full awareness that we may, misalign with the changes, and then the AP would result in required changes. And I think, and perhaps Ms. Steele would add, is that I think the thought on this particular AP, as we were planning to bring it to the committee tonight, is that the required updates were needed in advance of a policy changing coming to kind of represent the some of the changes in the practices that the district wants to see. And so just to highlight that it's not out of the ordinary necessarily for an AP to predate the policy, and to some of the points that are brought forward, certainly if the policy is going to be changing language or direction, that we would fully, and I think have fully anticipated the need to review that AP when the guidance of that policy comes forward. But we just didn't want to wait because we know that the policy work, and particularly this one, might take some time. And so I hope that provides a little additional background, just that to provide context for the difference and why the timing.
The other piece is that we do want to strengthen language and have really explicit and clear direction for the system, but we can't possibly put all of that into a document the size of an AP. I mean, it would turn into a very, very lengthy document, and we don't want to wait to start those conversations. So the goal was to get the first iteration of it out into the system so we could begin those other conversations and add some of the layers and pieces that we know are important and necessary, but we want to grow those collaboratively, so it's done through dialogue and through learning together and alongside one another. So that's the intention with it.
Thank you, Ms. Steele and Mr. Walsh. Next on our list is Trustee Mckay.
Good evening, everyone. The two prior speakers before me said a whole bunch of important things, and so thinking in the way that I think, I'm going to offer something to the board. The board has of course referred this policy, the inclusion policy, likely to be renamed soon, to the policy committee, and we're beginning to work on that. And that has been a process of discussion for us to do some of the work that Ms. Steele has talked about this evening with regard to, you know, how do you get that information? How do you include those voices? And so we're beginning to put together a process so that we can undertake similar work to what's happened with the AP at this point. And that will ultimately result in, of course, us coming back to the board with a policy. I think this dialogue and the comments that have been made so far is beneficial not only to the procedural work, but also to the policy. And I think what I see and what I might suggest to the board is that we take all of these comments this evening and we actually do a little bit of overlap work there. So where the feedback has been provided to the AP at this point, I'm going to trip over all my P words, it will serve us well in identifying the process and the policy work that we'll undertake. And then before we come back to the board, I think there's going to be a point in time in that process where we pull together with Ms. Steele and say, how do these look together? And make sure that we have some really clear and concise alignment. So I might even suggest to the board that this is just, you know, step A of this revision, because it is such a big topic. And that I think we can take all the feedback tonight and make sure that we have some really beautiful alignment that comes a little bit later this year, and done in a thoughtful manner, making sure that we're hearing everybody who's sharing their thoughts this evening. So I just want everybody to know that those thoughts might not turn into an AP that turns over very quickly, but it might look more like we come together and work on those things in conjunction with one another too, so that we see the alignment and all of those values and beliefs that all of us hold as very important coming together. So I just want to put that out there for the board, just to say that that's coming. It might seem a little bit piecemeal right now, but I think that alignment will come together beautifully a little bit later.
Thank you. So I'm next on the list, and I think there's been a lot of great thoughts already put forward, so I'll just try and keep it brief. I think there's going to be lots of opportunity for the board through the policy committee and staff and our stakeholders to work together on the policy. And I kind of see this as an interim update to sort of bridge the gap between where we are now to where we want to get to once we have determined what that policy is going to look like. So I'm just hoping that through our process, we'll find opportunities for some learning for all of us. So we all have a deep understanding of the different issues and terms and important considerations that need to go into this work. So again, I thank you. So moving on, I see the next on our list is Trustee Berzovic has not had an opportunity to speak yet, so I'm going to go to her, and then I will go back to Trustee Higginson after that.
I will be very brief. You actually said a lot of what I was going to say, Greg. I appreciate the work that you've done so far. I acknowledge that there's more work to be done. I think, though, that it is a good start, and I think it is important that we bring everyone together, because I think it's, as much as we all want the updated policy soon, we'd rather have it correct and thorough and a process where everybody's gotten their voices heard and all the concerns are brought forward, and do it properly and slowly rather than just getting it done. You know, so I just don't want you to feel discouraged by any of this. That, you know, it's not that we don't appreciate the work. It's just that we're realizing how much more there is to do. And yeah.
Thank you, Trustee Brzovic. Moving back to Trustee Higginson.
Thank you. Carrie, I do want to acknowledge the incredible work that you're doing. So thank you on that. I think that it might be interesting, and I just leave this with you, to have I know that there's folks at the table from all of our various partner groups, but sending this AP out directly to, you know, QP and NDTA and DPAC and asking them for their direct feedback, I think might help sort of, I know we've had lots of eyes on, but the final product to me feels like that might be helpful. And so I leave that at your discretion. And so this actually is a question not for you, so don't worry. It's actually more for our superintendent, and it's, you know, it kind of goes back to this issue about the policy and the process here, and what I've heard from you as well, Carrie, is the, you know, that people want to do this work, and I think the board wants to do this work as well. And I'm wondering what process has the superintendent thought about, you know, to develop the policy work that's critical. So has there been thought put into a process? Is there thought being put into an anti-racism action plan that will be coming to the board? There was that motion in June 2020, I think, that talks about, you know, coming back to the board with recommendations on a plan. And so I'm wondering what the superintendent's thought about what that plan would look like in terms of the process that the chair just talked about, and what, you know, how we are going to make sure that we are getting the right voices and hearing from people both in our district, but also people who have left our district. Just, is there thought into the plan, and when can we expect to hear those things? Thanks.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. Yeah, thanks. I have been working recently with Chair Mckay, as was mentioned, to come up with a process and include all voices around the district and go through a good process to come up with a good policy. I think it was already mentioned. We have a lot of pride in our inclusion policy, and it's been shared around the province. It's a rather new policy. Doesn't need to be updated, absolutely. So I think soon the chair will be able to describe what that process will look like.
Thank you, Superintendent Saywell. Do you have a follow-up, Trustee Higgins? I just see your...
Yeah, just my follow-up is just that I'm hoping that as part of that process that the chair brings back, or the superintendent brings back, that it does, you know, it sort of includes an action plan on this issue, because what I'm hearing is a lot of good work happening in a lot of areas, but it feels like we need to kind of lay them out for folks to be able to see where all the work is happening, and figure out, you know, this chicken and the egg conversation that we're having, so that we actually have an action plan. We actually have a plan on how we're going to address this in our communities, how we're going to connect with them, what we're going to do with that information, how it's going to impact the practice of our schools while we take on this big process. So I look forward to hearing on that plan, and I really appreciate the work you are doing, Carrie, on this. And I'm hoping that this process could make it easier for you, not harder. I also want to say, like, you know, the board wants to support this work based on a past motion, and so if there's more that's needed, then I look forward to our staff asking us for that level of support that might be needed. We've done that in the past with the creation of positions. We possibly could do that again. So I just am looking forward to doing this work. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask Trustee Mckay, you briefly had popped up on my screen. Was there something that you'd like to say?
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Yeah, so I guess I popped up to be a little more precise in the process. So the policy committee has, at this point, going to be contemplating a very detailed step-by-step process of how and who and when we consult through in order to even come up with a draft revision of the policy itself. The process that lays out after that would be to look at how does that policy connect with the APs that have been reviewed up until that point. And then from there, we would see the action plan that Trustee Higginson is looking and hoping for. So I recognize there was a whole lot of things in there, but I wanted to just state that it's the process that we were tasked with at the policy committee regarding the policy itself. And that conversation is upcoming in just days. So it is being undertaken, and it'll be less like the chicken and the egg, which one came first, and more like a couple of things side by side with a plan that comes out at the end. So I look forward to seeing that, and I guess I'm just asking you to trust us because it's coming and we promise.
Thank you, Trustee Mckay. So seeing no further comments, I'll just again thank Ms. Steele and staff for all your hard work on this. I know this is probably some of the most important and difficult work that we do in the district. So thanks again, and we will be continuing on with this this work through the policy committee, and I'm looking forward to that work. So thanks again.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. So we'll move on our agenda. Item 8.2, Mr. Walsh, regarding investments administrative procedure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this evening, we're bringing forward to the board administrative procedure with respect to investments. And so as the board, I think we've reported a couple of times is that the current interest rate situation for school districts, or well, for everyone, is incredibly limited. And so, for instance, this year we cut hundreds of thousands out of our budget due to the fact that interest rates have declined on our cash balances. So the AP is attempt to be as transparent as possible to guide the community and show the board what the intention to ensure that our cash balances, if available to us, are able to make some return to be able to come back into the system. So just perhaps it's helpful to go back to what a cash balance is. And so in our case, we have a variety of different projects. We have payroll, we have different liabilities that we keep cash on hand for. And so a good example is payroll. So we need to pay our staff, and so we have a couple of months of cash in the bank to pay our staff. So we always have a little bit more than we need in the bank to pay them. Now that money is constantly flowing out of the system, so we would always need that to be as liquid and available to us as possible. There are, however, some other areas where, say for instance, we are saving up for the new ND contribution. So we haven't got it yet, but we're going to keep talking about it. And so we anticipate that the board is going to have to contribute some funds to replace ND. So if we started today and we knew, for instance, that we were going to get support and then ultimately the build's not going to happen until 4 years from now, 5 years from now, we might have millions of dollars sitting in a bank account that are collecting 0.57% interest, where we could theoretically take that money knowing full well that we're not going to have to expend it for a certain period of time and put it in some sort of investment vehicle that's going to give us a greater return. And if you can think about the difference between, 0.5% interest on $1 million and 1% or 2% on $1 million, we're starting to get into a place where it actually has the ability to impact positively on our budget and support additional positions, etc. The other place that we have a funny thing that happens in districts is the way that we account for certain liabilities. So let's just take my vacation. And so what we're doing is we're setting aside money every single month so I'm going to be able to take vacation. So of course you want me to take vacation, so it's not likely a payout, but it's still going to be cash paid to me on my vacation time. But the way that we account for it under the rules that we have is essentially we are banking it for 12 months. And then, of course, it's going to get used, or it gets used throughout the 12 months. But because we keep continually banking it, we end up with actually a pot of dollars that's just continuously replenished. And so theoretically, we could use those cash balances knowing full well we're going to replenish them and put them away in a vehicle that's going to get us, you know, 1%, 2%, what it happens to be. So we thought that we want to explore this, and we will say that we are looking at a couple of options. And if you're interested in, you know, using the power of the search engine, we have been looking at the Municipal Finance Authority, which the school district does have access to. And so right now, a majority of our well, I guess about half of our cash balances is sitting in a government program called the Central Depository Program. And so that used to be about 1.5% for school districts. It's now 0.95. When we look at the Municipal Financing Authority, there are a number of short and medium term investment vehicles that are safe, that we could get access to. And so you can see options if you do Google. So those are some of the things we're looking at. And so what the AP does is it lays out the type of funds. Is it immediate term, medium term, or long-term funds that are available to us? And then what we might look to do with those funds, and limiting our ability to take risks, of course. And then, of course, a few other things that I think are important to note is that we are talking about internal loans. So the idea that, you know, if the facilities team comes forward and says, well, look, I have a project that we don't have the money for in the budget, but we know that the operational savings from it will be able to pay back the cost outlay in 3 years. We may want to look at an internal investment like that, get operational savings and a GHG reduction as a possibility. And then I also want to point out that the AP envisions specifically responsible investing in the context of our environmental sustainability policy. And so, for instance, the Municipal Financing Authority has a fossil-free investment vehicle to consider if we ever wanted to look that direction. And so really that's what it is to try to be as transparent as we can as we look to do that. And our goal is to find an investment vehicle that will actually have an impact, a positive impact on our budget without putting us at any risk.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Are there any questions? Seeing none. Okay, go ahead, Trustee Stanley. I have one. I'll go after you.
Hi. So to Mark, our Secretary Treasurer, that was for you, Charlene. You stole my thunder a little bit. I was going to ask about how our staff, how you considered our environmental policy in reviewing this, and that is because in the notes it talks about that this idea, or this what you brought forward, it was partially related or involved a review of the what investments of post-secondary schools, and a number of high-profile secondary schools have divested of fossil fuel investments. And so I was going to ask about that. I'm grateful that you considered that in the process. You kind of touched on it right now. I just want you to add a bit of information. It sounds like to me that you said that there are possibilities for us to look at investments that are fossil fuel free. Is that what I heard?
So through you, Mr. Chair, absolutely. And so again, when we look at what we've incorporated under the responsibility heading under page 26 of the agenda, pursuant to policy 1.5, environmental stewardship, a responsible/sustainable investment approach incorporating environmental social government considerations will be taken when making investment decisions. We would foresee that very much limiting our ability to invest in areas that particularly other institutions are divesting from as well. And to be fair, it's unlikely that we will have any significant funds that are return seeking, given our need to use the funds in medium term, that would actually be looking at equities. And if we were to do so, then it certainly would be of a environmental sustainable nature.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you. So do you require a follow-up, Trustee Stanley? No? Okay. I guess I'm next on the list here. So my question, Mark, is, can you help me understand a little bit more about the difference between internal loans versus just budgeting for certain things overall?
Yeah, so we can't go into a deficit for the purpose of, even though we have, you know, $30 million in the bank, we can't budget a deficit from an operating perspective. And so if, let's say let's say the facilities department found an opportunity to put $100,000 in a sustainable energy installation infrastructure of some kind, and said, well, actually, it's going to have a $20,000 per year impact on the bottom line of the energy use. What we then would do is we would just cut the energy budget by $1,000 per year for 5 years in order to ensure that those funds are available in the cash balance. So we haven't fully contemplated what it would actually look like in the end, but we wanted to include it in this AP so we could fully explore it, and we didn't want to have to come back a second time and say we've made a change. We just want to be transparent about it.
No, thanks. That's an interesting concept and way to think outside the box. So thanks for that. Moving on to Trustee Higginson.
Thank you. I concur on the thinking outside the box. I really appreciate it. So if I could just get some clarity, is it my understanding that most of the funds that you're looking to move are being held in the central deposit program currently? And the idea is that you could get a better return on those funds by moving them out of the CDP into another form?
Through you, Mr. Chair, not quite. So we might look to withdraw some of the funds. We certainly wouldn't be looking at withdrawing all of them, but it's actually what really got us thinking, not only just the CDP dropped a little bit, but it's actually more the fact that our cash balances in our regular account have gone up significantly. Think of the childcare units. They're the perfect example where we have millions of dollars sitting in a bank account that we know the builds are going to, we have a timeline when those builds are going to be complete. So we know that we're going to have, multi-million dollars in the bank in 2 years' time, collecting 0.57 if we don't do anything about it. And so it's more, I think, in the immediate term, that larger cash balance sitting in just the in the kind of regular private institution, and perhaps some of the CDP if we can find the appropriate investment. The idea is not to divest fully from the CDP, because I don't think that would probably be the most valuable for the system broadly. Saves the government money.
Would you like a follow-up, Trustee Higginson? Seeing no one else on the list, I have one quick follow-up through to Mark. So when staff makes these decisions to transfer funds, will the board hear about this during the various times when financial reporting comes back to the board? How are we going to know that it's, sort of advantageous for us to continue to do this? How are we monitoring it?
Sure. So through Mr. Chair, and maybe I'm going to get Ms. Lowe to jump on here, but certainly we anticipate that you'd be seeing them on the financial statements, and so we'd have notes of where the various investments would go. In the short term too, just because it's new, I think we would, our anticipation would be to kind of proactively give a board the update to say, here's what we've done, and we're watching it. We're not diving in 2 feet at this point, but maybe Ms. Lowe has a little bit more to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, through the chair. In the AP itself, we do mention in here that it would be reported for sure annually, and then it would be part, obviously, of the audit. The auditors would go through that as well, but it's something we could, if the board is interested, probably bring back in our quarterly reporting as well, and just go through, what decisions have been made, where it's at, what are the interest rates, etc. So, I think that's probably something we could look at exploring as well.
Okay, thank you. So I don't see anybody else on the speakers list. So I suppose we'll move on to item 8.3 with the first quarter financial report.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And sorry, just before I move on, could I just recognize the work that Ms. Lowe put into researching that AP and just express appreciation for that work. So the quarterly financial report, the Q1 is here, and I'm going to do a little bit of high level and touch on a few pages for you, but just from a high level perspective, the finance department, we like to talk about Q1 as of relatively little value from the perspective of a determination of how we're doing. And the reason we say that is because,
Sorry, Mr. Walsh, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was hoping that that Karen could please zoom in a little bit just for the benefit of those who have a bit hard time seeing, like myself.
Sure, I'll touch on those pages in just a sec. So,
thank you.
So the reason that we say the Q1 is of relatively little value is because by the two reasons. One is that given we're we're really a 10-month organization in many ways. And so when you think about Q1, we're dealing with the summer as well. So it's pretty difficult to, have an annual Q1, 2, 3, and 4 when one of our quarters is so disparate from the other quarters. And so it's useful to look back on how we were doing and spending in Q1 of last year, or more likely the year before, prior to COVID. And so just take that caveat. And the second reason that it's of relatively little use is because we make so many changes as more kids arrive, that expenditures are already outside of what we budgeted, because again, we noted last year we budgeted fairly conservatively from an enrollment perspective. We had a couple of surprises to the positive in the sense that our FTE at secondary per student has rebounded in addition to student increase. So a couple of those things that put our numbers out of whack from a budgetary perspective. So just to put that out there. The final one maybe I'll touch on, and Ms. Matthews has page 29 up, and you'll see at the bottom of page 29, and it's important to read this memo, including the notes. It shows that we have a budget or deficit of $2.9 million as of September 30. But it's really, really important that what happens is we get kids in the system, we start flowing supports for those kids, knowing full well that the ministry is ultimately going to fund those students at a later time. So the teachers, the EAs, those supports that we flow to schools to support the additional enrollment, ultimately we will get the funds for that. So we're not actually, I guess, are in a technical deficit at this point, but the reality is that it's not actually a deficit, it's a timing issue. So on page 30, I think it's a good opportunity to reflect some of the investments that the board has determined to make that we discussed in September. And you'll see a flow of the various items that the board has supported, some moves to local capital as well to support those items. And that just reflects the list there. So for your awareness. Excuse me, on page 31, we see in our operating fund, we can see the additional FTE that's been added since, so from our annual budget due to increased enrollment. In fact, I believe this number might even be higher because of some additional supports, but maybe I'll get Ms. Sutton to confirm that. And then you can see a breakdown of where those increases for the most part have occurred. And then finally, I am going to turn to page 34. Oh, sorry, 35. And then this is important as well. And so here's our local capital balance. And it's just important to remind the board of where we have finances available to support local capital projects. And so we as staff, what we do is we take this and we look at it and say, okay, well, wait, why is, lead and water, let's take lead and water. Why is it the same number as it was last year? And ironically, it's not. We've been spending the money, but occasionally we'll see, items that haven't necessarily been spent, and then we're able to potentially reallocate those funds for other needs in the district. And so it's just, I think for the board, this is really important to keep in mind about the assets we have in our local capital. And then finally, we'll just turn to page 36, which I think is an important note. And so this is, so Q1 finished like the day of our previous meeting. And so we weren't able to bring it to the previous meeting. We thought it would make more sense now. But we have made additional changes to the budget. And that's what you see on page 36. So we've got a significant amount of new revenues associated with enrollment increase. And then you'll see some expenses below associated with the budget on September 30. And then you'll see the line that talks about us being in a surplus for the year of 2.4 million, which the note will clearly outline that it's not quite accurate in the sense that we do have more resources. We talked about a number of additional supports for ELL. I believe it's 3.2. Some additional supports that are flowing to EA supports. And then we also will have a cost that we don't quite know the number yet, and that's our average teacher salary, which is going to cost us approximately $1 million, a little bit more than that. And so largely we're in line with, we don't have a lot of additional revenue to be able to expend if we need it. But we are able to flow those supports out to support the increased enrollment. So we're pretty happy with where we are at this time of the year and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. I'll just say I found it very, make sure I'm not muted here. Yeah, no, sorry. I found it very interesting that one thing that really stood out for me was the capital allocations and just thinking about all the projects that we currently have that our staff are working hard on right now, and it just was very impressive. So thank you to the staff for that.
Thank you, and I would offer to bring you on a tour of the facilities department and then taking a look at Mr. Sabo's whiteboard because it is overwhelming in there.
A lot of projects, so yes, thank you. Any questions? I don't see any in the chat, so barring that, we shall move on to item 8.4, which is our facilities.
Again, Mr. Chair, if I could just take a moment and just express appreciation for all of the work that Ms. Sutton put into the Q1 and our ongoing work to keep it updated. It is much appreciated. I will tell you from an internal perspective that work that gets done to kind of highlight when we might not be spending money is really important, because that email then goes out to our learning services team or whatever department and say, look, get spending, and so we're trying our darndest to make sure that we don't end the year in a significant surplus, and just want to express appreciation for the work that's getting done.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh, and thank you, staff. So if we want to move on with item 8.4, Long Range Facilities Plan Committee Terms of Reference.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so on page 37 is the memo that just outlines the fact that we're in line with the Long Range Facilities Plan recommendations. We feel pretty strong that we're moving a lot down the line. But tonight you see the terms of reference that have been discussed at the Long Range Facilities Committee, and talks about the purpose, the mandate, the membership, and of course the authority coming back not as a decision-making body, as a recommendation body, so for the board's consideration, and would recommend the motion that's there, and perhaps ask if Charlene would like to add anything to that.
Yeah, go ahead, Trustee Mckay.
Thanks. You've given me an invitation to speak, so I should take you up on it. This has actually been a really, really amazing process that we've gone through the last little while as we bring on board these new advisory committees to the board. We really have to reflect and ask the question, what is our purpose often? And I think that that's been really helpful. We drafted these terms of reference back in the spring. We've done a lot of revisions. We've taken them to the committee itself and asked for all of their feedback. There wasn't a lot of feedback there, which I hope is a good thing, because that means that we've included all of the voices that we're looking for, and if we haven't, then there's certainly room to add. The one thing I wanted to highlight that I was really pleased with is that we have 2 of our leaders for learning that have joined us on this committee as well. And so those voices are really important to have in the room, and they help us look at not just facilities, but land and how we utilize our spaces and places where we do the work of the school district. So those voices are very valued, and we're grateful to have them, and we look forward to any feedback that trustees have so that we can update a final draft or a final version and take it back to the committee.
Thank you, Trustee Mckay. So we do have a motion in the agenda. If someone would like to move the motion. Would you like to move the motion, Trustee Mckay? Go ahead.
Sure. That the Board of Education of School District number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, approve the terms of reference for the Long Range Facilities Plan Committee.
Thank you. And I see that's been seconded by Trustee Stanley. Would you like to motivate the motion?
I think I just did prematurely, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Is there anyone opposed to the motion? Seeing no opposition, the motion carries. Just thank you everyone for your hard work on this. It's much appreciated. Moving on to item 8.5, by-election. Mr. Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this evening we are bringing forward some proposed amendments to the board bylaw, trustee election and by-election bylaw. So what we've done is, I believe this is the first board-run election in quite some time. So there's a couple of changes with respect to the bylaw that we're proposing that really would only apply to this by-election, and if we ever had to run a future by-election, as the chief electoral officer would have a bit more discretion than in the context of a local government election that's happening at the same time. So these proposals, I just want to say at the outset, will not have any impact on us working with our municipal and regional governments in the regular election coming in a year's time. So as noted in the memo, we've reviewed the School Act and the Local Government Act to make sure that we are in alignment, and we've made a couple of changes, or recommended changes. So one of them is this, is that currently the board bylaw, the Local Government Act requires voting day, and then it requires 2 additional pre-voting opportunities. One of them in the Local Government Act is 10 days in advance of the voting day, and you can seek a different day, but we determined that we wouldn't want to in the circumstances. In our bylaw, we have another opportunity to do it 3 days in advance, or not, it needs to be 3 days in advance. We are seeking the board's support to change the bylaw to give the chief electoral officer the discretion to change, to pick essentially the other day. And so, for instance, we would probably anticipate it trying to do it on a weekend again to offer our facilities without interfering with our, student activities during the week, which 3 days in advance indeed would do. And so that's the basis for that. We would, of course, advertise pre-voting opportunities, and that is a statutory obligation as well. The other main one is that right now, the way that the by-election works is we are relying on essentially a list that we put together of electors. And so the Local Government Act says, if you want, you can take the provincial list of electors and declare it as your own, and then you can sign up anybody else on the day of the election if you want. And so what we're looking to do is that likely. In the alternative, and we're contemplating this as well, and we know this is happening in Prince George, is their list of electors is actually going to be limited only to those people that actually come and vote. So they're kind of register and vote on the same day. We're exploring that idea, but depending on the turnout, that could be problematic from a logistics point of view. And so what we're seeking in the by-election, or in the change to the by-election, is essentially the authority for the chief electoral officer to make that determination. And so it would either be the provincial election list plus the people that register at the voting times, or alternatively, just the folks that register at the voting times. And so we're just contemplating that, and we're seeking a bit of discretion to be able to make that choice. If the board doesn't like the idea of registration only on the voting time, then what we would encourage is that it be adopted, the provincial be adopted solely, and we can't do that without a bylaw. So the bylaw needs to reflect that. And then finally, we're looking for the discretion to create special voting opportunities, and we've taken this from other bylaws as well. And this is the idea that, say we have advanced polling at day 10 and advanced polling 3 days, but in this case, we're probably talking about 7 days in advance. What we also potentially would like to do, depending on the availability of resources, is say, okay, we might actually have a special voting opportunity on Gabriola because we're not going to have, you know, a 10-day and a 7-day on Gabriola because we're not actually required to do that, but we might have a special one. And so what that means is we can actually spread out the resources of our election officials in a kind of more balanced fashion. And so that's what the special opportunities would do. And then finally, you'll just notice there's a number. We like our definitions here in the Secretary Treasurer's office. And so you'll see there's some definitions in the bylaw that have been added, and a minor change to bring us into alignment with the Act. And so, yeah, sorry. And it's outlined in the memo. So it's there for any questions that you might have, and the recommended motion is there. Oh, and finally, if the board does support this, we have already asked for a meeting with Leaders for Learning to have a conversation with them, and we'll send them to our partners as well, and seek if they want like a specific meeting to go over what the changes are. It really shouldn't impact a voter's ability to vote.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. Are there any questions for Mr. Walsh? And if not, there's a motion in your agenda. Do I have any questions, or someone like to move the motion? I see that Trustee Stanley would like to move the motion. Go ahead, Trustee Stanley.
Hi, okay. Let me just pull that up here. Okay. So on page 41, if I'm correct?
Yes, it's also on the second page of the agenda portion of your package.
Oh, sorry, I'm not at that page. So stop me if I'm reading the wrong one. That the business committee recommends that the Board of Education of School District number 68 in Nanaimo Ladysmith give all 3 readings of the amended bylaw number 2, trustee elections, during the November 18th, 2021 special open board meeting, and that the Board of Education of School District number 68 in Nanaimo Ladysmith adopt the amended bylaw number 2, trustee elections, during the November 18th, 2021 special open board meeting.
Thank you, Trustee Stanley. And we have a seconder, Trustee O'Neill. Would you like to motivate the motion, Trustee Stanley?
I don't think that I can add anything to what Secretary Treasurer Mr. Walsh said, so I'm going to stand with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I will just ask Mr. Walsh a procedural question just to help us along the way here, just to make sure that everyone's aware of the voting rules for this one. So because this is, please correct me if I'm incorrect, Mr. Walsh, but because this is the business committee, it's making a recommendation to the board. This is a simple majority vote, but if it should pass and go to the special board meeting on November the 18th, for us to give all 3 readings, I believe there's a special requirement there. Can you please clarify if I'm correct there, Mr. Walsh? Is it 2/3?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. No, indeed, it is unanimous. And so what would happen is there'd be 2 motions. The first motion would be that the Board of Education supports the 3 readings to happen in one night, and then that motion needs to be unanimous. And then the next would be the bylaw itself. That would only be a majority vote. But the motion to have it be unanimous needs to be, sorry, 3 readings needs to be unanimous. And the one other thing I'll say is that if it is not, and if we need further time to consult, Our drop dead date to make this happen is 52 days before January 15th. And that's because in order for us to use the discretion with respect to using the provincial voters list, the Local Government Act requires that that bylaw essentially be done. That be declared 52 days prior to January 15th.
Thank you for that clarification. Okay, so is there any other questions or discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Is there anyone in opposition to the motion? Motion carries. Thank you again, Mr. Walsh. So we'll move on to section 9 of our agenda. We have a letter from Mayor Stone from the Town of Ladysmith regarding the Town of Ladysmith official community plan review. So there's a copy of the letter on page 47 of your agenda, and there's also a recommended motion included in the agenda as well. I'm not sure, staff, if there's anyone who wanted to introduce this item. Or perhaps there may be a trustee who would just like to table or read the motion. Go ahead, Mr. Walsh, sorry.
Well, thank you, Mr. I was going to say I'm able to answer any questions, but certainly we anticipate that a positive conversation at the Ladysmith Subcommittee, which is coming up in the very near future. And certainly the future of Ladysmith is right at the heart of the discussions of the subcommittee, so a very positive place to have the discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh. And I see that Trustee Stanley would like to move the motion. Please go ahead.
I do, but Secretary Treasurer Walsh, just a quick question. Do we need to refer specifically to the subcommittee, or are we okay with referring to the general committee and therefore we'll refer to the subcommittee?
Mr. Walsh, are you able to respond to that?
I think that the chair of the committee would have the ability to send it off to the subcommittee.
Okay. So I'm ready to move then. Thank you for the clarification. That the business committee recommends that the Board of Education of School District number 68, Nanaimo Ladysmith, refer to the correspondence from Mayor Aaron Stone, Town of Ladysmith, to the chair for response following further consultation with the Long Range Facilities Plan Committee.
And thank you, Trustee Stanley. The motion's been seconded by Trustee Berzovic. Would you like to motivate the motion?
Again, it's self-explanatory. This is just a matter of protocol and getting it to where it needs to be. And I look forward and I'm grateful for the opportunity for our governing bodies to work together. It's just another sign of good working relationships that we have with the municipalities, and I'm grateful for that opportunity from the Town of Ladysmith.
Thank you. Okay, so is there any other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Is there anyone opposed to the motion? Seeing none, the motion carries. Moving on, we don't have any unfinished business, new business, or anything for information. Do we have any questions this evening? I don't think so, but I'll just check with Ms. Matthews. I'm going to call it. Looking at the Q&A, doesn't look like we have anything this evening. So I'll look for a motion to adjourn. Moved by Trustee Stanley and seconded by Trustee O'Neill. Thank you. I guess we need to call that question. Is anyone opposed to adjournment? Seeing none, meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everybody.